First, let me say that how much we appreciate, as Naresh has just said at the end, how much we appreciate the great cooperation that we have with the CII. Thank you, Anjan, for being always at our disposal. We're really delighted with this possibility of a continuing dialogue with CII. And CII, of course, is a very important knowledge partner in the publication of the Global Innovation Index. Let us also remember. I would like, as it were, as an external party, to congratulate India on these extraordinary successes, that are repetitive successes that we've seen, particularly in recent years, and the jumping of 70 places, if I'm not mistaken, in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. By the way, we provide data for that index in cooperation with the World Bank, in particular in the area of trademark registrations, where you are down to, I think, a processing time of a month, if I'm not mistaken, a very, very short processing time. So this is of great assistance, I think. Now, on ease of doing business, let me say that I think, and Naresh has already touched on this, I think that the positive progress that we've seen, in particular, let me just say, because that's the area I'm addressing, in particular in the field of intellectual property, where we see that in recent years India has integrated further into the international system. So it has joined several of our treaties. It's already a member, of course, of a large number, but it's joined most recently the 2 copyright treaties from 1996. It joined in the last several years the international trademark system, of course. We believe that the design system is under close consideration and should follow in the next couple of years. So these are major measures of integration into the procedural system internationally, which I think gives great confidence to investors and partners. And I think the significance of all these is that in the contemporary economy, for several reasons with which you're all familiar, the basis of competition is, of course, innovation. And that has been said time and time again. And when it comes to competing in respect of innovation, of course there are several different ways, but one of the ways is through intellectual property, because intellectual property is protecting the competitive advantage that arises from innovation. And we see that around the world in the quite extraordinary increase in demand for intellectual property titles. So whereas the world economy is expanding at a rate of roughly 3.5%, intellectual property applications in every field are expanding by at least double that amount, and this has been the case consistently now for at least 10 years. So the latest figures, and we're about to publish some new figures, but the latest figures come from 2016 worldwide, and it's about 3.1 million patent applications. It's about 9.8 million trademark applications and 1.2 million design applications worldwide. These are extraordinary numbers which have gone up by hundreds of percentage points in the last 20 years. And that increase has been driven by several factors, of course. It's been driven by the domination of technology over the economy. It's been driven by practices of enterprises in seeking cumulative protection. So since intellectual property is a way of protecting the competitive advantage of innovation, then there are several ways of doing it, and we see that. So it's rare for any single product or service, for that matter, to be protected by one form of intellectual property only. If you look at films, well, once it was just copyright. But of course now, a lot of items are merchandised coming out of a film, There are trademarks associated with various elements of the film, and indeed there are spots within the film that are reserved for showing watches on the principal actors and so on, so that the intellectual property is monetized in a variety of ways. If you look at the smartphone, of course, patents are important. Designs are extremely important, and so too is the branding. And the dispute between Apple and Samsung, for example, in respect of smartphones, which was a multi-jurisdictional worldwide dispute, it was only about 29%, 30% patents. The major part was designs, as a matter of fact. So we see enterprises seeking cumulative protection around their competitive advantage, and that's driving up the numbers as well. What's driving up the numbers, I think, in addition, is of course the continuing phenomenon of globalization, so that when enterprises do seek protection, they're seeking it in a larger and larger number of markets across the world. And that's another significant factor. And then I'd say the final factor in seeing this rise in the numbers is, of course, geography, and the changed geography and the entrance of new players into the scene, so that innovation is now multipolar. You know, we lived in a world for at least the last 200 years in which it was essentially Europe, then joined by North America, with the rise of American manufacturing at the end of the 19th century in particular, joined by Japan more recently, now then joined by China, now joined by India, and more generally Asia. So it's a very multipolar scene. Now, in that context of multipolar innovation, the competition, of course, as you all know better than I, is incredibly ferocious. And the competition is based in and around innovation. For example, the competition is based on the attraction of human talent. Now, India is supplying human talent to most of the corporations in the world, most of the leading corporations in the world. A large number of countries have introduced measures to attract specialized talent. The United States is one, which has practiced this system for a very long while with its H5B, I think, temporary visas. And those quotas are filled within 2 weeks of being opened each year in the United States of America, but they're not the only country that is poaching human resources as part of their strategy to advance innovation. We see it happening on a variety, as I said, levels, but one of the other levels in which this competition is playing out is, of course, the regulatory system. So the provision of a good regulatory system which facilitates doing business is a very important factor in the overall competitive mix of a country in the area of innovation, which is in turn, of course, the basis of all competition. Let me say just make a few other points then. I would say that when we look now at this field of intellectual property and the regulatory system and how it can be made to serve, well, both innovation and then the competitive interests of various countries, I think one of the things that we should be concerned about is, of course, cost. And the cost of we do not want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg here. We see these numbers of applications rising, but for enterprises, cost of doing business, of course, extremely important factor. Now, it's a very difficult thing to address in the area from a policy perspective, cost of intellectual property protection, because the major component of cost is the lawyer and attorney fees. The second major component is translation in worldwide. And then only, and it's about 1%, are the administrative fees that you have to pay government authorities, including ourselves. So from a policy point of view, we can do something to try to address the translation by way of reducing costs through, we, for example, have an extremely good neural machine learning-based translation system which can improve productivity for translation, but it's not going to substitute for translation. For the attorney fees, well, we operate on the basis of first of all, trying to simplify procedures. So we have, of course, a treaty on simplification of procedures in the area of trademarks, one in the area of patents. We are trying desperately to conclude one in the area of designs, where there's a lot of unnecessary procedural irregularities and differences all around the world. But the best way to reduce lawyers' fees is to have more standard procedures across the world. I feel free to say this because I once was a lawyer. So through procedural, I think, standardisation, we can make a slight impact on cost. And then, of course, our systems, the Patent Cooperation Treaty for patents, Madrid for trademarks, where in both of which India is a major user, major player, and then the Hague system for designs, which, as I mentioned, we are hoping India will join. It's being seriously studied. These also contribute to cost reduction because you can file one patent application instead of 152, one international patent, and so on, one international trademark application. So this does facilitate the ease of doing business. These are all very marginal advantages and incremental advantages, but in a world of such ferocious competition based on innovation, these marginal incremental advantages, I think, are important in improving the competitive posture and position of enterprises. I think then my last comment would be that I think we have a real danger that we have to be careful about, in addition to cost in the intellectual property system and in its function of serving business and enterprises and innovation with complexity. So we have this. What we see is that as a result, as a consequence of the focus of attention, policy attention on innovation around the world, then intellectual property is creeping into absolutely every sort of relationship between different countries. And so you have a very complex regulatory environment for a start, because once it was just the national regulatory environment plus whatever the country chose to join at the international level administered by WIPO. But now, of course, it's the national, it's every bilateral trade deal that you're doing, it's the plurilateral, whether RCEP or whatever other, intellectual property is usually a major component and often the stumbling block. And at the multilateral level, it's not just WIPO, but also WTO now, and the World Health Organization, and, because it's a horizontal issue, so, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, it's all over the place. So this is not necessarily a bad thing, it's a sort of a natural evolution of the importance of innovation and science and technology in the economy, but we do need to have a coherent system and one where all of these various obligations entered into add up to something that industry is able to deal with. There are a huge number of questions that are on the horizon, and I think it's a bit too early for us to be thinking of the answers, where I think all collectively as a community still thinking of the questions. And there are many, many questions. How do, for example, how do you protect something that's constantly changing? An algorithm is constantly changing. What sort of is it an infringement of copyright? in an area in which we're going to see very shortly artificial intelligence generated music? Is it, although I just read an article this morning actually saying that the lyrics produced by artificial intelligence are terrible, so maybe it's not going to be so quick, but is an infringement of copyright to feed copyrighted musical works into an algorithm in order to generate artificial intelligence music? There are many, many questions, and there are many answers and many policy positions out there, those who favour open science, those who favour open data and open exchange of data, which is, of course, the basis of, the data is the basis with the algorithm of artificial intelligence, and the various policy positions we see being taken by countries around the world, whether concerning data localization or competition law or protection of personal data, all of which relate to your competitive position and the ease of doing business. So this is a very complex world, I think, also, that we're seeing evolve, and we have to be careful to, keep it reasonably simplified so that it does serve the interests of, I think, business, industry, and the research community, let's not forget, and innovation. So perhaps I should stop at that point, but it's very nice to be able to be here.